Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second talk on science and religion with Professor John O'Brien. Special welcome to those preparing for confirmation and their parents. So this evening you'll be able to learn a lot. If you missed the first session and you want to catch up on that later, it's on YouTube, and the next final session will be in a few weeks' time. But I think tonight Professor John has got something very interesting to tell us. We can all learn something. So I'd like to invite John forward to enlighten us.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second installment in this three-part series. Each of these lectures is designed to stand alone, but what I do hope to do this evening is to build a little bit on what we dealt with in the previous session. So, to begin, first of all, thanks to Father Con for the opportunity to do this once again. I'm an ordinary average scientist with some the views of my own, the errors of my own, but if you want to read about this, there is an enormous literature, and we'd be very happy to put you in the right direction if you want to delve a little bit deeper. So, like last week, we're going to avail of technology because we're all looking at this from quite a distance. We're going to begin with an audience poll just to get you thinking about the topic of science versus religion. I'm going to look at two milestones in the area of perception of science and religion. One is, of course, the classic Galileo, and the second one is evolution. And these seem to be always the flashpoints that people cite when it comes to science and religion. I want to spend some time asking the important question, can science study God? And look at some scientific studies in the medical literature, especially on intercessory prayer. Some slides on science limitations and challenges, and then some messages, and of course you will have the opportunity using technology to ask your own questions. So I would ask you to begin already to think about that. Now, I want to begin this evening with a brief clip. Well, before that, let's just cite Jonathan Sacks, because since our last lecture, Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi, actually passed away. And he was a celebrated communicator on topics of faith and science. And one of his most apt phrases is, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. And with that, I want to show a very brief clip. It's by somebody that we met in the last session called Francis Collins. Now, Francis Collins was the director of the Human Genome Project, which already published its results 20 years ago, almost. He was a director of the National Institutes for Health and a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which is a group of eminent scientists assembled by the Catholic Church. Not all of them, by the way, are Catholic. Francis Collins is a Christian, he's not a Catholic, but he was selected for his duties on the Pontifical Academy because of his experience in genomics and in biology. So with that, let's hear what Dr. has to say.
Science is about trying to get rigorous answers to questions about how nature works. And it's a very important process that's actually quite reliable if carried out correctly with generation of hypotheses and testing of those by accumulation of data, and then drawing conclusions that are continually revisited to be sure they're right. So if you want to answer questions about how nature works, how biology works, for instance, science is the way to get there. Scientists believe in that, and they are very troubled by a suggestion that other kinds of approaches can be taken to derive truth about nature. And some, I think, have seen faith as therefore a threat to the scientific method and therefore to be resisted. But faith in its proper perspective is really asking a different set of questions, and that's why I don't think there needs to be a conflict here. The kinds of questions that faith can help one address are more in the philosophical realm. Why are we all here? Why is there something instead of nothing? Is there a God? Isn't it clear that those aren't scientific questions and that science doesn't have much to say about them? But you either have to say, well, those are inappropriate questions and we can't discuss them, or you have to say we need something besides science to pursue some of the things that humans are curious about. For me, that makes perfect sense. But I think for many scientists, particularly for those who have seen the shrill pronouncements from extreme views that threaten what they're doing scientifically and feel therefore that they can't really include those thoughts into their own worldview, faith can be seen as an enemy. And similarly, on the other side, some of my scientific colleagues who are of an atheist persuasion are sometimes using science as a club over the head of believers, basically suggesting that anything that can't be reduced to a scientific question isn't important, and it just represents superstition and should be gotten rid of. Part of the problem is, I think the extremists have occupied the stage. Those voices are the ones we hear. I think most people are actually kind of comfortable with the idea that science is a reliable way to learn about nature, but it's not the whole story. And there's a place also for religion, for faith, for theology, for philosophy. But that harmony perspective doesn't get as much attention. Nobody's as interested in harmony as they are in conflict, I'm afraid. My study of genetics certainly that Darwin was right about the nature of how living things have arrived on the scene by descent from a common ancestor under the influence of natural selection over very long periods of time. Darwin was amazingly rigorous answer.
Okay. So the key takeaway, I think, from Professor Collins' brief interlude is that science does not and cannot answer all the questions. And it's a topic that I'll return to again during the course of this evening and indeed the next evening. So with that, we all have our perceptions on the relationship between science and religion. And what I want to do at the beginning of this evening's presentation is to put 3 questions to you. You can access the poll online at Slido, at sli.do, and you've got the event code here on the slide. So the 3 simple questions are, science and religion are different domains. Leave things be, keep them in separate boxes, and everything will be fine. Secondly, science and religion are separate, but complementary, and should be united in seeking to improve our human condition. And then the third option is that science and religion are overlapping and need to be working together in our modern world. So please take a few minutes to complete that. We're not going to give you the results until the end of the evening. So I'll just leave it up for 30 more seconds, and then we will move over to Galileo. Okay, and that poll stays open until the end of the evening, so we will come back to that at the end of the session. So Galileo, everyone's heard of Galileo. They've heard different stories probably and different versions of the same story. So I want to begin the Galileo story with yet another poll. What do you think of Galileo? Was Galileo wrong and was the church right? Maybe Galileo was right and the church was wrong, which is the version you probably hear most in society. And perhaps an alternative version of events was that there was fault on both sides. So please, again, visit Slido and enter your selection. And Paul is here to look at the results live, and we're going to give you live results before I get into the actual narrative on Galileo.
Just so you're aware, that poll just opened up about a minute ago, so if you didn't see it a couple of minutes ago, it's open now, that second poll about Galileo.
All right, Paul, let's hear it.
Okay, so the results at the moment are Galileo was wrong, the church was right, 0%. Galileo was right, the church was wrong, 27%. There was fault on both sides, 73%.
Wow, okay. Pretty clear winner then is number 3. And I think when you hear what I have to say, I think it will support your view that there was fault on both sides. But what you normally hear about, of course, especially in the media, is that Galileo was a victim of persecution, and more than that, a victim of persecution by the church. But it ain't that simple. Let's look at the details first of all. So, Galileo, as you know, built on the ideas of Copernicus. Copernicus was a Polish monk, and he built up the idea that the Earth revolved around the sun, the so-called heliocentric model. And I've highlighted the word model here. At that time, it was considered a model. It wasn't regarded as the truth, but it was a simple mathematical model that was quite accepted and taught in Catholic schools and universities at the time. Galileo approved of Copernicus's idea and built on it. He also, of course, discovered using a telescope, the first time that a telescope is used in astronomical observations, he used a telescope to discover the moons of Jupiter, which he called the Medici stars, by the way, after his boss, who was Medici's of Florence. So that's the story in a nutshell. The chronology of events, he was born in Pisa, and he studied there, and then he became an employee of the Medicis, the famous, rich, powerful, political, notorious family in Florence at the time. One could argue that the Medicis were the most powerful and richest people in the world at that time. So he was tangled up in some very interesting politics. The Medicean stars they were actually the moons of Jupiter, but he obviously was playing a very important political game by making sure that the Medicis were associated with these discoveries. He made quite a lot of money, of course, as well, from building and selling telescopes, and he would have been well rewarded as an employee of a very important dynasty at the time. Then in 1610, he published the Starry Messenger, which again was about the heavens. He already had started to build up his views on whether heliocentricity, the Earth going around the Sun, or geocentricity, the Sun going around the Earth. He'd already well developed those at that stage, and there was a lot of correspondence, at which point he was asked really to be very careful in the way he presented his facts, not as truth, because he was lacking evidence, remember, but as a mathematical idea, a model, as it were. And that was written to him in the form of a letter following the Inquisition, which he seemed to accept at the time. He published the Assayer in 1623, read it to the Pope. The Pope was quite impressed by it, but one of the characteristics of Galileo is that he was quite an arrogant individual, and he didn't miss the opportunity in these publications to attack his enemies. So he detested Aristotle, for example. So he regarded Aristotle as ranking alongside the miserable things in life, like the plague, urinals, and debt. The only thing that he detested more than Aristotle were the people who actually supported the Aristotle idea of the world. And he regarded those people as pot-bellied theologians who locate the limits of human genius in his writings, i.e. the writings of Aristotle. He wasn't always right, and this was one of his limitations. For example, in the Asir, which he dedicated to the Pope, no less, he took the opportunity to attack one of the Jesuit mathematicians of the time called Orazio Grazzi, who had proposed that comets were heavenly bodies. Galileo didn't agree, incorrectly. He believed that comets were simply the reflections of vapors that were coming off the Earth. So in this case, he was wrong, but he didn't see that he was wrong. And this, again, is I guess, a reflection of what I said last week about the difficulty of being objective in science and seeing things as they really are. Galileo's strength of personality often clouded his vision, and that was his great limitation. Now, let's look at the rest of the story. He published a dialogue concerning the two chief world systems in 1632, and this was the start of his troubles, because in that he used a technique called a straw poll, a straw man. The straw man was a hypothetical discussion among three people, two philosophers and a layperson. And in classical Galileo style, he called the layperson simplicio, i.e. simpleton. And the simplicio person was, of course, speaking as if he was speaking for the Pope and for the clergy at the time, and for the theologians. So again, it was quite provocative, and then led to the trial. And after the trial, of course, he was sentenced to house arrest, which he spent in a villa in Florence for the rest of his life. So not as bad as it sounds, really. And he died then in Florence in 1642. And during that period of house arrest, he, of course, had many productive years. He continued to publish. He had an observatory at his disposal at his residence, so he continued to observe and he continued to publish. So it wasn't an unproductive period of imprisonment, so it were. So let's look again at the context of this, because the context is very important, and it's very important in the sciences to take different perspectives on the same problem. If you have a one-eyed approach to the problem, you're not going to read it correctly. And there is a background, a backstory to the Galileo story that is very important to hear. So there is the social and cultural backdrop of the time. So remember, we're just a few decades after the Reformation. There's a lot of bloodshed, turmoil. It's a really troubled time in Europe. Troubled time for the church, troubled time for everybody involved. It's in the middle of the 30-year war. The 30-year war was like a war across Europe. Up to 8 million people died at the time. And they died of starvation and of disease, of course, more than for the war itself. You've got the politics of it. People did not like Galileo. He picked up enemies quite easily because of the way he approached things. He was not a diplomat by any means. He worked for the Medicis, who were also distrusted and also attracted a lot of criticisms. There were assassinations. There was a lot of money, a lot of politics. The Medicis had 2 popes. They were quite influential. And then looking at it from the church point of view, of course, the church did not at the time want to appear to be too radical or too careless against the backdrop of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Then you had, of course, the politics. The church had moved its allegiance to supporting the French as opposed to supporting the Habsburgs. They were looking to the Spanish, who were looking for strong conservative leadership in the church at the time. So a lot of backdrop, a lot of politics. Of course, the approach taken by Galileo, I've mentioned before, didn't help. And the Church, of course, also wanted to protect the Aristotle principles for many reasons, because much of the theology at the time was allied with Aristotle. And of course, we have to admit, because you said in the poll that you believed there was wrong on both sides, and of course there was. It took a very, very long time for this issue to be resolved. And I think Pope John Paul II spoke very warmly of Galileo when he finally put this to rest during his period as Pope in the middle 90s. What is not true, and I think we have to call this out, is that Galileo had irrefutable evidence. It's often seen as a battle between a good scientist with the truth and with the facts against the church who is not listening to the science. Well, remember that Galileo was still promoting the Copernican view of the universe. Copernicus had not developed a complete model. In fact, the model was so incomplete that he had to, in using the model to predict the movement of the planets, he had to put loops in, because he thought they were circles as opposed to ellipses. It wasn't until Kepler came along, many years after Galileo, that the final model was actually improved. So the model was still incomplete. Some would say it was actually wrong. It wasn't true that Galileo was unchallenged by his peers. As I mentioned, the Jesuit Father Grazzi, he was a scientist, and he challenged Galileo. So there were many who were questioning Galileo's use of evidence. And remember, in one of the publications I mentioned, Galileo had a theory on the tides, that it was the sun that was actually influencing the tides. But any common sense would tell you that there were two tides a day. If the sun was the full story, there'd be only one tide per day. So it's not just about the sun. There were other factors involved as well, like the gravity from the moon. So the problem with Galileo is that he tended to assume that his evidence was complete when sometimes it wasn't. It wasn't a challenge to church doctrine. It was a challenge for the church, but it wasn't a fundamental challenge of doctrine. And then finally, what's very important, I think, is that this is not church persecution of science. It was the church at the time seeking to be absolutely correct in the scientific method that Galileo was so strong in promoting. It was actually holding Galileo to actually his own promise that he would be a good scientist. Many scientists, you will find volumes written about Galileo. And it's, many scientists and philosophers who've looked at the Galileo story are not terribly complimentary of Galileo, but they're also saying that it's not necessarily a unique situation. It could happen today, for instance. Paul Feyerabend, who was a philosopher in UC Berkeley and at the University of Zurich, observed that were Galileo here today, it's quite likely that he wouldn't have had an easier time. We still have the difficulties and the challenges. If somebody's science and somebody's evidence is incomplete, they will be challenged by their peers. And the other problem is that if there was a Galileo in 2020, they would find that arguments by themselves are rarely enough to get something published, accepted, or financed. The idea must fit the prevailing ideology and the prevailing philosophy of the time. If Galileo, for instance, were to turn up in Weybridge this evening and propose to do a study of a new drug that had not been tested for safety, if he proposed to give it to humans, it's quite likely the police would be called and Galileo would find himself under arrest. So there are some things that, even though you are a scientist and you believe in yourself, you need more than that. You need objective, preferably third-party evidence. Now, one final point about Galileo, and that is from St. Thomas Aquinas, who many centuries before had already actually suggested that perhaps the model of Ptolemy, and remember Ptolemy was the original source of this idea that the sun was the center The sun was not the center, but potentially it was the Earth. So his point was that, that maybe, while it might appear to be so, it might not be true. The phenomena may actually be explained by some other schema not yet discovered by men. And there is another context here, of course, as well, and that is, I keep remembering the words of T.S. Eliot. The truth is more than most of mankind can bear to hear. Sometimes it's very difficult when you're telling a layperson that what they think they're seeing is not what they're seeing. So people were seeing the sun rising and the sun setting, and to tell people that what they're seeing is not the Earth in the center of the universe, but actually the Earth going around the sun, that was a difficult one to get across to the layperson. Now, moving on, the next story is very similar to the Galileo story, because at the heart of it, again, is belief and a paradigm shift. Galileo is correctly regarded as the father of science, even though he had faults, and we have to recognize that. On the other hand, you could argue that Darwin is at the heart of biology and at the heart of what we understand about evolution. And I'm going to start this session with another poll, just to get you in the mood for thinking about biology. And I'm going to ask you what you believe to be the degree of DNA similarity between us humans and chimpanzees. And we know now, because we've done the measurements, Professor Collins was at the heart of both of those projects. So we have a genome for the human, we have a genome for the chimpanzee. Is it 75% similarity? Is it 89%? Or is it 99%? Over to you. Paul, how does it look?
Okay, so results still coming in, but at the moment 75% is, well, okay. For 75% there's 12% at the moment, for 89% there is 33% at the moment, and for 99% there is 52%.
All right, so a mixed bag, really. And of course, smart people are probably Googling this while I'm speaking, so that's cheating. We'll have to disallow that. Actually, it's 99%, which is quite surprising. It's surprising when you consider how similar we are to our nearest biological relatives. And yet, we're the ones that are studying the chimps and writing papers in Science and Nature, not the other way around. That's kind of telling you something, that there's a lot more to this than percentage similarity in our genomes. And with that, let's look at evolution in a little bit more detail. So again, there's a person at the heart of this, and that's Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, again, was a remarkable individual, another iconoclast, another person who brought about a huge paradigm shift, and with it, a huge societal change as well. So he developed original ideas on the origin of species, but he also built on other ideas at the time. And he was a geologist and a biologist, so he used both biological observations and he used fossil records as well. He wasn't the only one in the field. And remember what I said last week about standing on the shoulders of giants, the observation by Newton. Science is incremental, and it does depend on the work of many, many people. And sometimes an individual comes along and they benefit from all that work, and Darwin was in that category. So he was basing his theory on observations, which is really remarkable. And remember Professor Collins' observation that he didn't have access to molecular biology and genomics that we have today, for instance. The morphology that I'm talking about here was the morphology in the case of the Galapagos finches of just the beaks. And then finally the publication was in 1859, and you could argue that all hell broke loose after that because of the various interpretations and reactions to it. So again, as I said, it was primarily driven by observations in the Galapagos of the big shapes in different species of finch, which were adapted for the food that was available on those islands, whether the food was insects, for instance, or whether the food was nuts that had to be cracked open. Darwin observed, of course, that one species cannot change into another species. So his argument then was there was a common ancestor that adapted. And this is called, of course, natural selection, that the environment that they were living in led to the selection of those characteristics and those traits. But once again, the commonality between Darwin and Galileo is that there's a huge social backdrop to the story. For one thing, Darwin, biologically, the story was well received, and he had a good bank of evidence. He was a prolific writer, and his writings are truly remarkable considering how long ago it was and what he had to work with. But the social backdrop, of course, is that you had, at the time, Mr. Karl Marx and his friend Mr. Engels, and both of those seized on the Darwinian idea of evolution as support for their ideas. The idea that there is no God, there is no need of a God, because now we've got a law that says, here's how it happened. So, needless to say, Darwin became a celebrity. He was both caricatured and feted by society. The scientific reception wasn't totally positive. There were mixtures in there because Darwin, remember, had very limited understanding of biology. He didn't understand, all he had was morphology. He didn't understand genetics. He didn't understand inheritance. That came much later than that. And then, of course, the radicals seized on this theory and applied labels like survival of the fittest, higher and lower races, for instance. It became quite socially divisive in the wrong hands, not because of Darwin. Darwin was innocent of that, but it was again used as a social club with which to try and force radical changes. It led also, of course, to some militant atheism. Thomas Huxley is one such example. He was known as Darwin's bulldog, for instance, and he wished to see the foot of science on the necks of our enemies. And by that, of course, he was referring to the churches. He was referring to not just Christianity, but probably all faiths. Huxley was the origin of the word agnostic. So again, the science here has become corrupted by those who have other designs on its ultimate use. I want to add, as an aside to this issue about evolution, that research on evolution is not closed. It's ongoing, and it will continue forever. So there's a huge field of research now in the area of both evolutionary biology and in the area of astrobiology. Could life have started in a little warm pond, as Darwin described it, where you had a mixture of organic raw materials that would combine chemically into some form of starting blocks, building blocks for life? And there was a famous experiment done in the 1950s by Stanley Miller in the US, where he had a flask with water, ammonia, hydrogen, and he put a spark in and circulated it for a long period of time, and he found a few amino acids were formed in this mixture. And from that he surmised that he had the starting point for a biological molecule called a protein. But there's a long way to go from a protein to a cell, and from a cell to an organism, and from an organism to a human being. So it's interesting academically. It's nice science, but doesn't prove that we came from a warm pond in the early prebiotic Earth. There are also many assumptions in this type of research in terms of the atmosphere of the early Earth, because we can't know. So one of the fundamental weaknesses of this type of approach is that it's really not verifiable. It's not easy to really equate this to any concrete model of evolution. One area of science that I mentioned that Darwin was completely ignorant of was the area of genetics. Darwin assumed that there was a gradual evolutionary process and that there was a blending process between different parents, which gradually led to a different species as evolution progressed. This is not quite accurate. And probably one of the most radical pieces of biology research, probably as radical, maybe more radical than Darwin, was that of the birth of genetics, which was actually, we can thank Gregor Mendel for, and this actually provided a basis for evolution. Now, a few words about Mendel himself. Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian monk who lived in what was then Silesia. It's today the Czech Republic. And he worked in a monastery. His motivation for studying the reproduction of plants and animals was really to explore the work of God. And his work wasn't recognized during his lifetime, unfortunately. It was at least 30 years before somebody said, wow, this guy Mendel is a superhero, because he provided a basis for the understanding of evolution. And apparently we know from the evidence that is available that Mendel actually read the work of Darwin, but not vice versa. Apparently Darwin was completely ignorant of Mendel's work. His work on inheritance provided a basis for understanding evolution, but it also showed that it was discontinuous. There were little packets of information that were shared on a discontinuous basis. And the work he produced in the mid-19th century probably did more to help improve agriculture than any other discovery in biology. It helped a more targeted production of hybrid species rather than the random approach that had been done up to then by people like Burbank in the US. It also underpinned improvements in medicine. And it was in the UK, for instance, that in the early part of the 20th century, there was an increasing understanding of inborn errors of metabolism, which led to some rather nasty effects in humans. And that was explained, of course, using the Mendelian model. And once again, Mendel had a mixed reception, interestingly enough. His work was banned in the Soviet Union for a period because the Soviets didn't believe that the genes could be influenced by the environment. It was against their ideology at the time. And one more slide on Gregor Mendel, just to show you how fascinating it is. All he had to go with, he was looking purely at colors and shapes. So it was green and yellow peas, it was green and yellow flowers, it was wrinkly and smooth peas. We call these phenotypes today. Phenotype is the appearance, what the gene actually gives rise to in terms of what the actual plant was doing. So we called them phenotypes, and it was Gregor Mendel who coined the terms dominant and recessive genes. He didn't coin the word gene, but he coined the term dominant and recessive. And we hear all about these terms now. For instance, redheads have 2 copies of a recessive gene for red hair. So the recessive and dominant is with us even today. So moving on then, another key question. Can science study God? And we touched upon this last week, and it's a pretty important question because remember that from an early age, those of us who are Christians, we've been taught that thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to the test. So testing God is really off limits, even if we have a scientific method that could do it. But my contention is that, as Professor Collins already said this afternoon, this evening, you cannot test some things. We cannot answer the questions why. So science cannot it cannot and does not answer some key questions. Remember the scientific method slide I showed last week, where you have to, first of all, formulate a problem, and then you have to have a testable question. Are these questions about God's intervention in our world, are they testable? In most cases, they're not. And I wanted to visit one specific example this evening. I'm only going to take one example of many, and that is the topic of intercessory prayer. So there have been a few studies in the medical literature on the role of prayer in healing. And generally speaking, people who are people of faith are healthier than people who are not of faith. And that's an easy enough question to test. You can test it without even asking the people. Prayer, on the other hand, is a rather different matter. So this is just one study that I've selected. It's possibly the best conducted study, published in the American Heart Journal. The conclusions were that intercessory prayer had no effect on complication-free recovery, and that in people who were told they were going to be prayed for, it was associated with higher incidence of complications. But as many observers have said, one of the problems with this is there's something called a nocebo effect. If you tell somebody something might be bad for them, or there might be an untoward consequence, you actually might produce a negative outcome. So the strengths of the study was that they had a lot of people, they had clear outcome measures, and they had a randomized sample of test groups. The weaknesses, on the other hand, is that it wasn't blinded. And ideally in a study, to prevent bias, the people shouldn't be aware that actually they're being studied or that they're in any specific group. And that was not the case in this. The intervention is the biggest weakness of the study, because the interventions were phrased as follows: may or may not be prayed for. This is the intervention. Will be prayed for, or a piece of paper that said, for a successful surgery with a quick, healthy recovery and no complications. So we know that this is not really the type of prayer that we recognize when we pray for someone. We're in territory here that is not scientifically testable. And even if you didn't accept that argument, there's a statistical argument as well, where the actual power of the conclusion, so-called p-value, allows for a 1 in 40 chance of it being a false conclusion. Furthermore, no information was provided to the intercessors. So people were asked to pray for people they didn't know. They had no feedback on the outcome. It was a very weird, strange, and I would honestly say not scientific and not terribly Christian process. And then overall in this particular study, there was a higher rate of complications anyway. So your background complication rate was high. And that would lead you to question, is it really, is this a real observation, or is there more to it? So I will leave, and I'd be very happy to take your questions on this. If you put questions into Slido, we'll come back at the end, because I realize that I'm going through it rather quickly. Now, a few words about science challenges today. We're often presented with the scientism argument that science will answer all our questions. Science is perfect, and we have no need of any other worldview other than that of the scientist. But again, there are serious questions, even among the scientific community, about the limits of science. Many have written about the limits of science. So one limitation, of course, is reproducibility. And often there are issues with reproducibility of science. There's clear issues with consensus among scientists. Good science requires a lot of debate and a lot of conjecture and refutation before it lands on the right path. It was Karl Popper, who said that Science is really only a provisional thing. It's constantly evolving and constantly being updated. And you've seen the examples of the transition from Ptolemy to Copernicus to Galileo to Kepler to Newton to Einstein. It's a constant evolution of thought all the way along. And no one model is necessarily complete. It constantly is updated and completed. And consensus changes with each generation. There's a new paradigm, we're calling it fourth paradigm science, which people say is data-driven. So there's an explosion of data now, which is really causing challenges for people interpreting the new form of science. Such is the volume of data being generated that artificial intelligence is needed to do a lot of the interpreting. Human capacity being overwhelmed to some extent by the capacity to generate data. So the ability to generate data is exceeding our ability to make sense of it. We're increasingly presented with pseudoscience, and I'll show you a few examples of that. P-hacking is where you do a lot of replications in the hope that you'll get a finding that will be significant. And then you'll call that out as a result, as a success story. It isn't that simple. I can't imagine Gregor Mendel, with his meticulousness and his care and his honesty, actually falling for that type of, I would say, dishonest behavior. But unfortunately, it's a reality. Because in science, there are the trappings of fame and the trappings of money. And the key, of course, for many people is publications, getting publications out there. And that leads to the final point here, is the explosion of publications. Now, I'm going to gloss through this slide. It's rather too small to see, but the key takeaway from it is that there's about 6 publications a minute being published in the learned literature, more than anybody can keep up with. And so the amount of data is now way beyond what anybody can actually keep up with. Now, moving again on the same theme of limitations of science, I'm quoting Pope Francis here because he's advocating in his recent encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, that there needs to be more dialogue between science and other disciplines, and even among the scientific disciplines themselves. And the risk he's pointing out is that a single scientific advance will be only seen with one possible lens. Again, to the point I made last week, we become one-eyed creatures looking at the world and producing a very, very narrow worldview. The world is much more than the single perspective that science can give us. So he's advocating, Pope Francis is advocating viewing from more than one perspective, especially looking at it from a societal and a world perspective as well. I'm showing a street lamp here because it reminds me of the drunk who was stopped by a policeman. He was on all fours under a street lamp in the dark. And the policeman said, what are you doing on the ground? And the drunk said, I've lost my keys. And the policeman said, where did you lose your keys? He said, well, I lost the keys in the park. So the policeman said, why are you looking under the lamp then? He said, because that's where the light is. And unfortunately, this is our problem. We shine the light and we ignore the parts that are not illuminated by that light. So we should obviously take care that we're only looking where the scientific light is shining. There are more forms of illumination than the scientific approach. Again, I keep quoting Karl Popper, but Popper is also careful to point out this issue of the provisional nature of science and the fact that it's constantly evolving. And he points out that words themselves are not enough because you can actually change the question and change the interpretation if the words change. So we need to be extremely careful sometimes in finding the right expression of words even when we're actually describing something. I mentioned the issue of reproducibility and the quality of science. There's a lot being published in recent years, including John Ioannidis, who is at the University of California and has attracted a lot of positive and negative acclaim because of his publication, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. Now, it's a provocative title, but his point is that as we get more and more publications, of course, errors will creep in. And his simulations show that for many study designs and settings, it's more likely that a research claim is false than true. This is not fraud. This is not deliberately misleading results. It is simply a fact that sometimes, if you do a lot of replications, you get chance findings. And you've got to be open to that and careful that you're not, again, as I said last week, that you're not fooling yourself. Remember that. The first rule, don't fool yourself. The second rule, you're the easiest one to fool. So we've got to remain objective. And he's pointing out as well that there may be prevailing bias in these publications. One of the most important sources of bias, of course, is the bias toward publications. Journals like to publish positive findings. They don't like to publish negative results. That's a problem. Now, why does science need scrutiny? Well, we can look around. A good example, and probably a topical one in the context of vaccination, was the Andrew Wakefield example, where he linked the use of the MMR vaccine to autism, falsely, I must say as well. This paper was withdrawn. And again, it's a good example of why corroboration is needed, why a strong peer review, strong scrutiny is needed, because if the wrong science gets into the press, the damage it can do can be immense. So anybody who's advocating strong scrutiny and strong oversight is actually right, always. Evidence changes over time, and the science changes with it. It has to. I'm just taking a few examples. One is from the Marie Curie Museum in France. You can read the card, but you can see the flasks in the background. And these flasks were sold in the 1930s. They were designed to bubble radon gas into water so that you could drink it. We know now that radon is a cancer-causing gas. We know it's dangerous. Marie Curie herself died of cancer because of exposure to radium and to other radioactive elements. So in the 1930s, this was believed to be a good thing. It was believed to be healthy. A short few years after that, we knew the truth. And so this would be regarded as crazy now. And yet it's an interesting historical artifact that in the museum in Paris, that these devices actually are still on display as testimony to an erroneous view of what might make you healthy. And go back a little bit further. This book was published in about, I think, 1859. There's a version of it available in Amazon if you're interested in buying your loved one a copy for Christmas. But again, there was a huge interest in the 19th century in the shape of people's heads, believe it or not. And they took from the shape of people's heads the inference that they had certain characteristics. So here we have the man who is a genuine husband and the man who is an unreliable husband based on his head. And just in case you're feeling left out, we've got the same for the ladies, the genuine mother and the unreliable mother based on the shape of the head. And these are amusing now, but at the time, of course, many believed in it. So we've got to be on the alert for pseudoscience, and we've got to be on the alert for the fact that science will evolve and change over time. Now, we've heard a lot, at times about dogma, and dogma is often brought up in the context of the Galileo debate. Science has got its dogmas, and it's got a big problem with it, to such an extent that a new journal is in the process of being published, and will actually be published next year, edited by some eminent scientists, notable among them Peter Singer, who is a Princeton philosopher and ethicist, and the journal is called the Journal of Controversial Ideas, because science does not like anything that contradicts the prevailing worldview. So this is an initiative by respected scientists to invite, again, contrary views in the hope that it might enlighten. Now, with that, we come to the poll that we started with this evening, and I'm going to ask Paul to give us the results on the three questions that we put, the three worldviews. So there is no right or wrong answer here, but it'll be interesting in the context of the next few minutes' discussion to ask what your thoughts were. Paul.
Okay, so first question, or the first possible answer was science and religion are different domains, leave them be. That attracted 15% of the vote. Science and religion are separate but complementary and should be united in seeking to improve our human condition, 68%, and the clear winner. And science and religion are overlapping and need to be working together, 17%.
Well, thank you for your responses. Briefly on two topics, and one is this idea that it's the Noma versus Poma argument. Noma is not, and it's the idea that science and religion are not overlapping, they're in separate boxes, and everything will be more peaceful and better if they're kept in those two simple boxes. A contrary view to that is the view of the theologian and scientist, Oxford scientist, Alistair McGrath, who prefers a partially overlapping magisteria, where there are overlaps that should be explored. Now, what's the official view on these things? Well, Darwin already had a view, and his view was that science has nothing to do, science has nothing to do with Christ. So clearly, he was in the first box. Non-overlapping, nothing to do with it, keep them separate. That seems to be also the view of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. Clearly, it's a difficult one for governments. And I think it's important that we look at things. You cannot switch your Christianity off when you go in the lab. You know, it's very important that you think as a Christian, even if you are practicing as a scientist in terms of a lab career. There is another view, and that is from Francis Collins himself, who proposed a movement called Biologos. And Biologos is an alternative worldview to that of the creationist movement in the US. A view that there is complementarity, it is very much the middle option, that there is complementarity and a necessary, important relationship between science and religion. And then a final view here is that of a theistic science. And the theistic science is a little bit like the creationist movement, whereby the missing gaps in science, one puts God in there. It's again the theology of the gaps that I mentioned in the last lecture. And again, that would not be, again, supportable or sustainable. To sum up here, I think it's very important to arrive at a very simple message at the end of this rather complex discussion. There's a book that was published in 2008, the same year that this publication of the National Academy of Sciences. It followed a conference in the presence of Pope Benedict. And the title of the book was Evolution and Creation. And I think it sums up the entire content of the book, evolution and creation. So the two together. It's not evolution or, it's evolution and. So I think one can actually see both working in harmony. But in working in harmony, I'm going to finish by citing Nietzsche. Nietzsche, the famous philosopher who declared that God was dead. He was also the philosopher that Jonathan Sacks cited in supporting a need for a transcendent objective truth in helping science to do what it needed to do. And in this, he's saying that basically you have to have an external objective truth in advance of your science, otherwise the science will not actually be able to be of value. So, key takeaway messages this evening. First of all, it's important, especially from the case studies of Galileo and evolution, that we look at things in more than one perspective. It's not just about science, it's about the background context, the societal, the social, the political even, if you will. There are many studies emanating and ongoing on the study of evolution. I find them academically interesting, but none answer the fundamental questions that Francis Collins mentioned at the beginning of this evening. Why? They can explain some of the hows and some of the pieces, but they do not present you with a big picture. And there were many studies attempted on intercessory prayer, on interventions, but they really are not very scientific and are, in every case, inconclusive. So again, it's not helpful to read these in the scientific literature and say that's evidence or not evidence, as the case may be. It's simply not testable. And then finally, to the last point, I'm heartened by the responses to the last poll, because science and religion are complementary and overlapping worldviews. I think there are spaces that are not overlapping, but each can actually support the other in producing a transcendent, objective version of the truth. I'm going to finish again with Einstein, this idea that the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious, the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and true science. And we can look at colour in the form of an equation, we can look at colour and appreciate the beauty of it. We have to actually appreciate both to actually see the world as it really is. And I opened this evening with a quote from the former chief rabbi. I'll close with a quote from Pope Francis, which was tweeted recently, in which he said that science is enriched by the dialogue between societies, enriched by the dialogue between science and faith, which opens up new horizons for thought. The light of faith needs to enlighten scientific advances so that they respect the centrality of the human person. So that's the key takeaway for this evening. With that, we'll take some questions, Paul.
Okay. We have a handful of questions at the moment. I think the first one I'll go with is, are there any lessons the Church can learn from Galileo and Darwin stories?
I was reflecting on that earlier, and Pope John Paul II was extremely complimentary of Galileo. In fact, he was more complimentary of Galileo than many of the scientists actually that have written about Galileo. Scientists don't generally like arrogant people, especially arrogant scientists. The lessons, yes, it could have been handled, it could have been closed earlier because it was allowed to fester for a very long time. One of the biggest problems we have is that hindsight is 20/20 vision. So it's very, very easy for us in 2020 to cast ourselves back 400 years and say, you know what, we should have done that differently. And that's too easy. But I think time, it just took a long time. And there is another point here as well, and we'll come at it next week. We're going to deal with the controversies next week. And one of the observations that Alistair McGrath had about the controversies was that the church often didn't rise up to speak and explain itself and take the, let's call it for want of a better term, take the fight to those who were actually not telling the truth or were presenting a distorted view. And sometimes that's necessary to be out there with the facts rather than letting the facts, the false facts, influence the debate and lead people to think something that isn't true.
Next question, and I think we'll probably make it the last one because we are running over time. Someone says, the belief in God requires one to suspend belief in the laws of nature. How do you see science and religion coexisting, if not through ignoring one to believe in the other?
Well, you see, I disagree with that. Again, to repeat the key point, evolution and creation, they're not exclusive. And so one of the problems that science and the science and religion debate engenders is that we're told that you have to choose. You have to choose one or the other. We're given this, again, conflict. It's a sucker's choice. You have to have A or B. And you don't have to have A or B. You have to step back and take the worldview that is the correct worldview and accommodates that which is scientifically supported, and that which faith as a source of objective transcendent truth gives us. Both are complementary. And it's a bit like the conflict between Einstein and Bohr, when they had two different physical models of light. One was a wave form, a wave function, and the other was a particle, a photon. And the issue was, it can't be both. How can you have, if you look at it one way, it's one thing, you look at it another way, it's another thing. And Bohr finally said, we'll have to accept that both views are complementary, both are correct, and both need each other. So it's not just religion versus science, it's science versus science as well. With that, thank you very much for watching, and thanks for your patience and your questions. And I'm going to allow Father Khan to have the last word this evening. See you on the 9th of December, hopefully.
Thank you very much, John. That's very interesting. I'm sure everyone at home appreciated that, and thank you obviously for your very hard work in preparing for tonight. So, as John said, the 9th of December is the final talk. We'll advertise that in the newsletter. But if you're struggling to buy a Christmas present for someone, here's an idea for you. We bought some of these books. We got them in from America, so you can't get them into shops or even on Amazon or anything here. It's called Brilliant: 25 Catholic Scientists, Mathematicians, and Super Smart People. Okay, so many of you might not have known that Mendel was a monk, and there's many other brilliant scientists who you see them mentioned from time to time, but no one ever says they were a monk or a priest or a Christian or whatever. So we can see where people did bring their faith and their scientific gifts together. So if you want to buy, these books are really for older children, I think. But actually, I read some of it today. I was learning myself. So even for adults, I think they can be useful. We have a few of them in the parish, and we've got another order traveling across the Atlantic at the moment. But anyway, thank you very much for joining us, and all the best. And may Almighty God bless you all. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.